Thank you, Adam, for the Skype interview. I'm here in Islamabad and you are in Berkeley, California. That's 12 hours behind us, so it's morning here and pretty close to midnight there. But this is such a wonderful opportunity and my first chance to speak to you about your books. They are literature at its best. They're about people, brave people who have fought against the terrible forces of darkness in the 20th century. So they fought against Stalin, against Hitler, against Franco. And your latest book is this one, Spain in Our Hearts. What I want to know from you is, why are people so brave? Now, these were people, such as in this book, who sacrificed everything. They knew that there was only a very slim chance of winning, but they fought for principles. So why, knowing how the odds are against him, did they still fight?
Well, I think usually people don't know whether they're going to win or lose, but they're in a situation where they feel they have no choice. I mean, if I look at the people I wrote about in my last book who were fighting Francoism in Spain, here the Spaniards were living in a country that was a new democracy. All of a sudden, a group of right-wing army officers seized power, started a civil war, made very clear they intended to impose a military dictatorship. And I think many Spaniards felt that they would rather die than live under such a dictatorship. And so they went to war. Particularly inspiring to me also was the story of the many thousands, tens of thousands of foreign volunteers who came there from the United States, from Europe, from India, from Egypt, from all over the world to fight with them. I think most of those people were optimistic at the beginning that they were going to win the war, but I think they too often felt in a larger sense, if we, it may be a choice between being here or doing nothing and then ending up living under fascism as it comes to our countries too. So I think people take part in these struggles partly out of the hope of victory and partly out of a sense that this is what gives their lives meaning.
Such people who fight for principles, not for any material gain for themselves, they are so rare. But wouldn't you say that it's because of them that humanity sustains itself?
It really has, I think, because you know, I'm always attracted to write about, to study, to identify with people who had the hope of changing our world in a way so as to make more possibilities for justice, more equality, more human rights. And I was privileged to know several of the American volunteers who went to Spain in the 1930s. Fought there, in some cases were wounded. The ones I knew, of course, I got to know them many years later, 30 or 40 years later, they all survived. But roughly a quarter of the Americans who went to Spain to take part in that particular war did not survive. Those who did felt that they had fought for something meaningful. They felt that they had fought the first battle of World War II. The first time that people were actually engaged in a war against fascism that broadened to a full-scale war that encompassed so much of the world from 1939 onward. So they felt proud of what they had done.
You know, yesterday's world looks relatively simple. You knew who to fight against. There was colonialism, so you had to fight the imperialists. Then there were dictators like Stalin, like Hitler, like Franco. But colonialism is on the way out. And I guess we just don't have dictators like the old ones anymore. So it seems to be a lot more complicated. In your opinion, what are today's big fights? And secondly, are those fights actually being fought?
Well, in some sense, it's more complicated in today's world because there isn't a clear, outright war going on. There isn't somebody recruiting soldiers who says, you know, sign up here and we'll give you your uniform and your rifle and your training and send you off to the front, and there you will find yourself fighting the fascists or whoever. It's not like that. I think the battles are more complicated. They are more insidious. Here in the United States, for example, I think we have a kind of creeping authoritarianism being emanating from Donald Trump in Washington, who would clearly like to run this country like the strong men overseas whom he so much admires, and makes no secret of his admiration for people like Vladimir Putin in Russia and Viktor Orban in Hungary and Erdogan in Turkey. And we Americans have to fight against that in every way that we can. And many of our friends right now, as I'm speaking to you, are spending all of their time volunteering in the elections that we have coming up in November of 2018, which will decide the composition of Congress. We also have to fight against the fact that in this country, as in so many countries right now, elections are not always fair. They are slanted in many different ways. They're interfered with electronically by outside powers. We think the Russians here in the US, but finding the exact proof of how that is done is difficult. And it becomes extremely frustrating when you volunteer hard and work for a long time in something like an election campaign, and then suddenly at the last minute, unknown forces are pouring millions of dollars into supporting the other side that you're fighting against. That's one thing that we can do in my country and in countries that have electoral campaigns where there is, you know, freedom for people to organize. Sometimes what people do can be something different, where there may be forms of resistance that don't involve electoral politics. Again, to take an example from the United States, just because it's very vivid in our minds right now, because it's something that's happened quite recently, one of the big problems we have is that essential social services, like education, public education, are being defunded because the right wing wants to see all possible government expenditures reduced. Well, so in several states in the U.S., most recently Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Arizona, public school teachers have gone on strike. And it's particularly remarkable that it happened in those states because all three of those states are states that voted for Donald Trump by a large margin in 2016. So it's been exciting to see these public school teachers get organized, go on strike, and it's a reminder that everywhere in the world, the freedom of labor to organize and battle for the rights of labor is a tremendously important thing.
You mentioned several countries, but you didn't mention mine, Pakistan. We too have a version of Donald Trump. He's got many of the same qualities. He's an absolute narcissist in love with himself. He's called Taliban Khan because he has nothing bad to say about terrorism. He wouldn't have become prime minister but for the fact that he had the establishment with him, the all-powerful army and our judiciary. On the other hand, Americans have got a very powerful, a vibrant civil society, unlike us. So I want to ask you, what is the chance that Donald Trump will be defeated in the forthcoming elections? And is there also a possibility that he could be defeated before that, thanks to the efforts of you and your friends?
I sure hope our resistance is going to be successful, but I have worries about it because the power that big money has in the United States to influence public opinion, to influence the course of elections, is just enormous. Thanks to a very, very, very reactionary Supreme Court in this country, all restrictions, essentially, on money in politics have been removed. And people can pour millions of dollars into electoral campaigns without disclosing where it's coming from. To me, that erodes the very basis of democracy. And it makes it much harder when we divide countries into more democratic and less democratic to consider the United States among the more democratic ones when this happens. We certainly do have a vibrant civil society, and I appreciate it, and I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for the fact that we have, strong opposition newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and that the government doesn't control the media. But Trump still, in effect, does have his own private television network, Fox News, which totally reflects his point of view of the world, and is the most watched TV network in the United States, because the power of demagoguery in all countries where it exists, I think, is very strong, because demagogues can offer to a population that's discontented, that senses it's losing grounds, it offers villains. It offers people who can be blamed. And Trump, of course, is a master of that. And I'm sure that Imran Khan in Pakistan is very good at blaming somebody else for the problems of ordinary Pakistanis as well.
Yesterday's world looks relatively simple. You knew who to fight against. There was colonialism, so you had to fight the imperialists. Then there were dictators like Stalin, like Hitler, like Franco. But colonialism is on the way out. And I guess we just don't have dictators like the old ones anymore. So it seems to be a lot more complicated. In your opinion, what are today's big fights? And secondly, are those fights actually being fought?
Well, that's a big question. Colonialism certainly was a major force in how the world was shaped 100 years ago, 150 years ago. I think that we're not yet free of all of the after effects of colonialism. When I look at some of the troubles in Africa today, for example, I see the after effects of colonialism, where these were countries that for many years, until around 1960, when most of the African countries became independent, experienced government essentially as an organized system of theft. A system of theft that basically benefited the mother country, be that England, Belgium, France, whatever. And I think it's no surprise that in much of Africa today, government continues to be an organized system of theft that benefits the local dictator, warlord allies, multinational corporations who formed alliances, and so forth. But there are a number of other forces at work in the world today. I think one that is going to affect all of us, of course, is climate change, where as the world gradually gets hotter, it is going, and perhaps not so gradually as things progress, it is going to greatly increase flows of refugees out of the scorched parts of the earth, from Africa and the Middle East. It's already, I think, been a contributing factor to the enormous flow of refugees from Africa and the Middle East across the Mediterranean to Europe. And that flow of refugees, of course, is something that has been used by demagogues in Europe, people like Orban in Hungary and so forth, for their own purposes. This is only going to continue. And of course, one thing I think that the United States and Pakistan at this point have in common is that the leadership class in our country, in our respective countries, is in both cases quite contemptuous of science when it comes to, in the US, accepting that science has identified global warming, has identified human beings as a cause of it, has pointed out what could be done, and of course, Trump bizarrely dismisses all this as a Chinese conspiracy, does nothing, favors the coal industry, favors the fossil fuel industry, and is trying to turn his back on what is clear, obvious scientific knowledge. This, to me, is a very dangerous thing, the denial of science all over the world.
Absolutely. And that's another commonality between your Donald Trump and ours. They both hate science, they don't understand it, they know nothing about it, and yet they scream against the idea of Darwinian evolution. But anyway, I have a question to ask you. You investigate, you research your characters very meticulously. You look at the original sources, you go out, you meet people, sometimes you've met those very people yourself, and you're very methodical, but there's possibly another way of encapsulating those great moments of history. So, for example, here in Pakistan, there used to be a writer, a very great writer, Saadat Hasan Manto. He lived at the time of partition, which was absolutely the bloodiest period of the subcontinent's history. There were maybe 2 million people who died, Hindus and Muslims. But he doesn't write about it in a realistic way as you do. He invents stories, he fictionalizes. So, for example, there's a mental asylum, and at the time of partition, the inmates of the mental asylum are given the choice whether they want to go here or want to go there. And it's a wonderful, gripping story. So, did you ever think of doing a different kind of writing?
So the question is, why write nonfiction instead of fiction? I love to read fiction. I'm a great admirer of Saadat Hasan Manto. I've read a book of English translations of his wonderful short stories and admire the way he evokes the great tragedy of partition. And I always love fiction writers who deal with the politics of their time, with the great moral and political issues of the times that they're living in. But I seem to be fated to write nonfiction instead of fiction. Maybe in my next life I'll come back as a novelist, but in this one I seem to be able to do it better with nonfiction. And we live in a world where there are so many interesting people, so many moral struggles that matter, that these are the things that I'm attracted to write about. And I love doing it in a way where I can show people in the source notes for my books. Everything I've quoted in here has a source. Everything I've said is all true. I haven't made anything up. And there are no shortage of such things to write about in this world. Just consider, for example, the life of Iqbal Ahmed, someone whom I had the privilege of knowing and whom I admired enormously, a remarkable man who battled for justice. If you invented a character like that as a novelist, people wouldn't believe you. But if you wrote about the real Iqbal Ahmed, all that he stood for, all that he did in his remarkable life, you would have a true story. So those are the kinds of things I like to write about, and I hope I can continue to do so for as long as I'm able.
And certainly I too, and all of us, hope that you will keep writing and keep fostering the spirit of resistance, not just in the United States, but everywhere where your books reach. It was wonderful talking to you. Goodbye.